5 minutes before I was supposed to say "I do," the doors at the back of the chapel swung open, and a woman I had never seen before in my life walked down the center aisle holding a baby boy with the exact same stubborn cowlick, the exact same deep-set brown eyes, as the man standing at the altar waiting for me. I want you to picture it with me, because I have relived this moment more times than I can count in the months since. 200 guests in a restored limestone chapel outside Austin, the late afternoon light coming gold through the tall windows, a string trio playing something soft as I stood at the back with my father's arm looped through mine, waiting for my cue to walk down that same aisle. I remember, specifically, the particular quality of nervous happiness I felt in that final minute, my father's hand steady over mine, my bouquet of white ranunculus trembling slightly with each small movement, the officiant giving a small nod toward the string trio to signal the beginning of the processional. I remember thinking, in that last untouched moment, that I had never in my life felt more certain of anything than I felt about walking down that aisle toward Grant. Instead, the doors opened early, and a woman in a plain gray dress, her face pale and set with a determination that told me she had rehearsed this moment as many times in her head as I had rehearsed my own vows, walked halfway down the aisle before stopping, turning to face the altar, and saying, loud enough for every single guest to hear, "Grant, he's 8 months old today. Don't you think it's time everyone here knew he existed?" If you're new here, this is the channel for the brides who almost didn't see it coming and who found the strength to see everything clearly the moment it mattered most. If a story like mine makes your chest go tight the way mine still does thinking about that chapel, hit subscribe, because what I learned over the following 2 months about my fiancé, about his family, and about exactly how long that secret had been hidden from me is going to make you understand why I never once regretted the decision I made in that doorway. Now, let me take you back to where this relationship actually started, so you understand exactly what I thought I was walking toward that afternoon. My name is Simone Bellamy, and I am an architect, the founder of a small but respected design studio in Austin specializing in adaptive reuse projects, old warehouses, and forgotten historic buildings I'd spent a decade learning to see the hidden bones of and bring back to life. I met Grant Aldridge 3 years before that wedding at a city planning symposium where he was representing his family's real estate development firm, Aldridge Properties, one of the largest and most influential development companies in Central Texas. He approached me after my presentation on a mixed-use renovation project I'd led downtown, told me it was the most thoughtful piece of urban design he'd heard discussed all year, and asked if I'd be willing to get coffee sometime to talk further. I want to tell you honestly, I fell for Grant quickly and completely in a way that still, even now, makes me wince slightly at how thoroughly I let my guard down. He was warm, genuinely curious about my work in a way that felt different from the performative interest I'd grown used to from men in his professional world, and he had a particular gift for making me feel like the most interesting person in any room we walked into together. His family's wealth, considerable as it was, never seemed to define him the way it defined so many of the other developers and heirs I'd encountered over the years working in that industry. He drove an unremarkable car. He remembered the names of the crew members on every job site we visited together. I believed, for nearly 3 years, that I had found someone whose character had somehow escaped the particular corrosion that so much money and family expectation often brings. I want to describe our early relationship in a bit more detail, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how thoroughly I believed in what we were building together. On our third date, Grant drove me 2 hours outside the city to a small, half-collapsed limestone farmhouse his grandfather had built decades earlier, a property the family had let fall into disrepair after his grandfather's death rather than developing it, the way Aldridge Properties developed nearly everything else it touched. He told me, standing in the ruined kitchen with afternoon light slanting through a collapsed section of roof, that he'd always wondered what a good architect would do with a space like that, and he asked, with what I understood even then to be genuine curiosity rather than performance, exactly how I would approach restoring it. We spent 2 hours that afternoon sketching ideas on the back of a paper coffee cup sleeve, and I remember driving home that night feeling, for the first time in years of dating in Austin's competitive, image-conscious social scene, like I had met someone who was actually interested in the specific texture of my mind rather than simply the fact of my presence beside him. I want to tell you, looking back now, that I've thought often about that farmhouse, about the particular story Grant told me that afternoon regarding why his family had let it sit empty rather than developing it. He said his grandfather had specifically requested, before he died, that the land remain untouched for at least a generation, a small act of resistance against the relentless development pace the rest of the family had built their fortune on. I found that story deeply moving at the time, a glimpse, I believed, of a quieter, more thoughtful values system underneath the Aldridge name's considerable wealth. I understand now, with the particular clarity hindsight eventually provides, that I never actually confirmed that story with anyone else in the family, that I accepted it entirely on Grant's word alone, the same way I would eventually accept, on his word alone, the story of what those 4 months apart had actually meant to him. I want to pause here and tell you about Grant's mother, Diane Aldridge, because she matters enormously to understanding everything that happened later. Diane had built Aldridge Properties from a modest regional home-building company into a firm responsible for some of the most significant commercial development in Austin over the past 2 decades, and she ran that company and her family with the same exacting, image-conscious precision. I liked Diane. In the early years of our relationship, or at least I respected her, the particular respect you extend to someone whose competence is undeniable even when their warmth is limited. It wasn't until much later that I understood exactly how far Diane was willing to go to protect the image she had spent her entire career constructing. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked back at the early, happiest years of a relationship and wondered which small, easily dismissed moments were actually the first quiet signs of something you weren't ready to see yet? Comment the word cowlick below, because you're going to need to remember that detail for what comes later in this story. Grant and I had one significant rupture in our relationship, about 18 months before the wedding. A 4-month period we broke up entirely, a separation triggered by an escalating series of disagreements about the pace of our relationship, about Grant's increasingly demanding travel schedule as he took on more responsibility within Aldridge Properties, about my own hesitation at the time to fully commit to a future that felt, in certain unguarded moments, like it might eventually require me to subordinate my own career ambitions to the considerable gravity of his family's business and social world. We ended things in March, both of us miserable about it, and did not speak again until Grant reached out in July, apologizing, telling me he'd used the time apart to understand exactly how much he wanted a future with me, on terms that genuinely accounted for my own career and independence rather than simply absorbing me into his family's orbit. I want to describe that breakup in a bit more detail because I think the specific texture of those 4 months matters enormously to understanding what actually happened during that time. I spent much of that spring throwing myself entirely into work, taking on 2 demanding projects simultaneously partly, I understand now, as a way of avoiding the particular ache of missing someone I genuinely believed I might spend my life with. I remember a close friend, another architect in my firm, telling me during that period that she thought the time apart was healthy, that it would either confirm what Grant and I actually meant to each other or reveal clearly that we'd been building something too fragile to survive real distance. I held on to that framing throughout those 4 months, telling myself that whatever emerged on the other side would be more honest, more solid than what had come before. I had no idea, believing that, exactly how much less honest the resumption of our relationship would actually turn out to be. I want to tell you, looking back now, exactly how strange it feels to know that somewhere during those same 4 months, I spent grieving our separation and throwing myself into work, believing I was simply giving both of us space to figure out what we actually wanted. An entirely separate relationship was unfolding in Dallas that would eventually determine so much of what came after. I don't think there was anything I could have done differently during that period, no version of those 4 months where I might have somehow anticipated what was happening at a conference I wasn't even aware Grant was attending. I share this detail simply because I think it's important to understand that the deception didn't begin with a single dramatic lie. It began, quietly, in a period neither of us fully controlled, and it was the 8 months of active concealment that followed, not the 4 months apart themselves, that constituted the actual betrayal. I believed him completely when he said that. I want to be honest with you about that belief because I think it matters to understanding exactly how thorough the eventual betrayal felt. We got back together in August and Grant proposed the following spring, a proposal that felt, at the time, like the natural culmination of finally getting the timing and the terms of our relationship right after that difficult period apart. I had no idea, saying yes on a hillside overlooking Lake Travis, that during those 4 months apart, Grant had met a woman named Camila Ortiz at a real estate conference in Dallas, that their brief relationship during our separation had resulted in a pregnancy, and that Camila had given birth to a son, Mateo, almost exactly 9 months before Grant and I resumed our relationship in August. I want to describe in careful detail exactly what happened in that chapel doorway because I think the specific texture of that moment matters enormously. Camila stood in the center aisle, holding Mateo against her hip, her voice carrying clearly across a chapel that had gone completely, utterly silent. "I've called you every month for 8 months," she said, still looking directly at Grant, who stood frozen at the altar, his face draining of color in real time. "I've asked every single time when you were going to tell her. You kept saying soon. You kept saying after the wedding, once things settled down. I'm done waiting for a version of soon that never actually arrives. If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, standing in my position, in the doorway of that chapel, still holding my father's arm, watching this unfold in front of 200 guests who had traveled from across the country to watch me get married, what would you have done in that exact moment? Comment below, because what I actually did surprised even me. I want to tell you what I felt, standing there, because I think the honesty of it matters more than any dramatic flourish I could add to make the moment feel more cinematic than it actually was. I did not scream. I did not faint, the way brides do in movies at moments like this one. I felt, instead, a strange, sudden clarity, the specific sensation of an enormous, previously invisible weight finally becoming visible all at once, as though I had been carrying something heavy for months without ever quite realizing its full size until the exact moment someone set it down in front of me and let me see it clearly. I let go of my father's arm. I walked, slowly, down the side aisle rather than the center one, past 200 guests who had gone almost unnaturally still, past my mother, whose hand flew to her mouth as I passed her pew, until I was standing close enough to Camila to see, clearly, exactly what she and I both already understood without needing to say it aloud. That baby's face was an unmistakable, undeniable copy of the man standing at the altar in a gray suit he had chosen specifically, because I'd once told him gray brought out his eyes. "How old is he?" I asked Camila directly, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. 8 months, 3 weeks, she said. Born in October. I did the math standing right there in that aisle, in front of everyone, the same math Camila had clearly already done herself many times over the preceding 8 months. October, 9 months back, meant conception in January, squarely in the middle of the 4 months Grant and I had spent apart, the 4 months he had described to me, repeatedly, as the loneliest, most reflective period of his adult life, a period he'd framed entirely around his realization of how much he wanted a future with me. He had never once mentioned Camila. He had never once mentioned Mateo. I want to describe what happened in my own mind during those few seconds of arithmetic, because I think it matters more than the arithmetic itself. I have a memory, oddly precise given everything else about that afternoon, of noticing the particular way the light fell through the chapel's tall windows onto Mateo's face as I did that math, catching the same warm brown in his eyes that I'd spent 3 years watching crinkle at the corners whenever Grant laughed at something I'd said. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity that felt almost like watching myself from several feet away, that I had spent the entire morning worrying about whether my vows would come out sounding rehearsed rather than heartfelt, and that worry now felt like it belonged to an entirely different woman, someone whose problems I could no longer quite access. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something important. Do you think there's any version of a 4-month breakup that would justify Grant's decision to hide an entire pregnancy and child from the woman he asked to marry him less than a year later? I want to know what you think, because what I discovered over the following weeks about exactly how deliberately that secret had been protected is going to change how you answer that question. I turned to face Grant, standing at the altar in front of the officiant, the string trio, 200 silent guests, and I said, clearly enough that everyone in that chapel could hear it, "I'm not marrying you today." I did not shout it. I did not need to. The words carried, in that particular silence, with more weight than any volume could have added. I walked back up the aisle, past my mother, who rose to follow me, past rows of guests whose faces I couldn't fully focus on, and out through the same doors Camila had walked through minutes earlier. I stood in the chapel's small entry garden, my wedding dress suddenly feeling like an absurd costume rather than the carefully chosen symbol of a future I'd believed in completely, and I let myself cry, finally, for the first time since the doors had opened. My mother found me there a few minutes later, wrapping her arms around me without a single word of explanation needed between us. Behind her, I heard the low, chaotic murmur of 200 guests processing what they'd just witnessed, and somewhere underneath that murmur, Grant's voice, urgent and pleading, calling my name from somewhere near the chapel doors. I did not go back inside. I want to tell you, standing in that garden, I felt something that surprised me more than the initial shock itself. A strange, steadying relief, the specific relief of finally understanding, completely and without ambiguity, exactly what kind of foundation I had almost built my entire future on top of. I want to describe the following hour in a bit more detail, because I think it captures something important about how quickly an entire carefully planned day can unravel into something else entirely. My father arranged for a car to take my mother and me away from the venue within 20 minutes, moving through the small crowd of stunned guests with a quiet, protective efficiency I hadn't fully appreciated in him before that afternoon. I remember sitting in the back seat of that car, still in my wedding dress, watching the limestone chapel disappear behind us through the rear window, feeling the strange, disorienting sensation of an entire imagined future collapsing in the space of a 20-minute drive. My phone, which I'd left with my maid of honor rather than carrying down the aisle, began buzzing incessantly the moment she returned it to me. Dozens of messages from guests, from vendors, from Grant himself, a wall of notifications I did not have the capacity to face that evening. I turned the phone off entirely and did not turn it back on until the following morning. My maid of honor, Delphine, a friend I'd known since architecture school, found me at my parents' house later that same evening, still in my dress because I hadn't had the emotional capacity to figure out how to remove it alone, and helped me out of it with the same careful, practical tenderness she'd shown helping me into it that morning. She didn't ask me a single question that night, understanding, somehow, that I needed silence and steady hands far more than I needed anyone to help me process what had happened. It wasn't until 2 days later, sitting on my parents' back porch with mugs of tea neither of us finished, that she finally asked, gently, whether I wanted to talk about it, and I remember being grateful in that moment for friendship patient enough to wait until I was actually ready. I want to tell you what Delphine said to me that afternoon on the porch, because I think it helped me begin processing everything with more clarity than I could have managed entirely on my own. "I keep thinking about how calm you were," she told me. "Standing there in that aisle, doing math out loud in front of 200 people. I don't think I could have done that. I think I would have just collapsed." I told her, honestly, that I hadn't felt calm exactly, that what she'd witnessed was closer to a kind of automatic, professional composure I'd spent a decade building in far less personal circumstances, the same steadiness I relied on walking clients through difficult budget conversations or structural problems on a job site. "Maybe," she said, "but I think that steadiness is exactly what let you see the situation clearly enough to walk away instead of getting swept into managing everyone else's feelings about it first, the way I think a lot of people would have." I have thought about that observation often in the months since, understanding more each time exactly how true it was. I want to tell you what eventually happened to that dress because I think it closes a small but meaningful chapter of this story. I kept it for several months, hanging untouched in the back of my closet, unable to decide whether to sell it, donate it, or simply let it sit there as a strange, silent artifact of a day that had gone so differently than planned. About a year after the wedding, I finally donated it to a local organization that redistributes formal wear to young women who couldn't otherwise afford a prom or formal event dress, a choice that felt, when I finally made it, less like closure exactly and more like a quiet, deliberate decision to let something beautiful serve a purpose entirely disconnected from the story I'd originally built around it. If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, would you have stayed in that garden, or would some part of you have wanted to go back in and demand a full explanation in front of everyone before leaving for good? Let me know below, because what happened over the following weeks, once I finally did demand that full explanation, uncovered something far more calculated than a single moment of panicked silence. I did not speak to Grant for 4 days after the wedding that never happened. I stayed with my parents, canceling vendor arrangements, fielding an overwhelming number of calls and messages from guests, family friends, and, eventually, reporters from a regional business publication that had gotten wind of the story, given the Aldridge family's prominence in Austin's development community. On the 5th day, I agreed to meet Grant, not out of any lingering hope of reconciliation, but because I understood, by then, that I needed the complete truth before I could fully process what had happened, and I understood that whatever version of the truth Grant offered me would tell me almost as much about him as the original deception itself. I want to describe those 4 days in a bit more detail because I think the specific texture of that waiting period matters. I spent much of it in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by belongings I hadn't looked at closely in years, old drafting tools from a middle school art class, ribbons from science fairs, physical artifacts of a version of myself that existed entirely before Grant. I found myself returning to those objects almost compulsively during those 4 days, as though touching them might help me remember, more clearly, who I actually was underneath the identity I'd spent 3 years quietly building around our shared future. My phone remained largely off during that period, except for brief, necessary calls to vendors and to my closest friends, and I remember the particular strangeness of watching the wedding hashtag I'd casually set up months earlier continue accumulating posts from guests processing the day online, a public record of an event that had ended so differently than any of us had expected. We met at a quiet coffee shop far from either of our usual neighborhoods, and Grant looked, when I arrived, like a man who hadn't slept properly in nearly a week. "I need you to understand," he said, before I'd even fully sat down. "I found out about Camila's pregnancy in February, before we got back together." I panicked. I didn't know how to tell you, especially once we started reconciling in August, because I was terrified it would end everything all over again, and I told myself I would find the right moment. And then the wedding planning started, and there never was a right moment, and I let it go on so much longer than I ever should have. I want to describe Grant's demeanor during that meeting in a bit more detail, because I think it matters to understanding exactly what kind of accountability he was and wasn't willing to offer in that moment. He cried, at one point, early in our conversation, a rawness I had rarely seen from him in 3 years together, and some old, deeply worn part of me instinctively wanted to reach across the table and comfort him the way I had done through countless smaller crises over the years we'd spent together. I did not reach across that table. I sat with my hands folded in my lap instead, watching him, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, that his visible distress in that moment was real, but that it was also, in its own way, a kind of request, an unspoken hope that my own instinct to comfort him might override my need for the complete truth. I had spent 3 years being the person who made things easier for Grant. I understood, sitting in that coffee shop, that I could not afford to be that person for even one more conversation if I wanted to actually understand what had happened. I want to tell you about one specific exchange from that conversation that I think reveals something important about Grant's own understanding of what he'd done. Near the end of our meeting, he asked me, quietly, whether there was anything he could have done differently that might have made me more understanding, had he told me the truth earlier in our relationship rather than letting it come out the way it eventually did. I told him, honestly, that the timing of the disclosure mattered far less to me than the fact that he had needed to be forced into it at all, that 8 months of active concealment, structured and legally reinforced by his own mother, told me everything I needed to know about what he had actually been willing to do in order to avoid a difficult conversation. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think there was one available to him that wouldn't have simply confirmed exactly what I'd just said. I want to tell you what I asked him next because I think the answer he gave revealed something far more troubling than simple cowardice. "Have you been supporting them financially?" I asked. Grant hesitated, just long enough that I understood before he even answered that the answer was going to be more complicated than a simple yes or no. "My mother set up an arrangement," he said finally. "A private account, structured through one of the company's holding entities, with a confidentiality agreement Camila signed in exchange for consistent monthly support. My mother handled most of the actual logistics. I saw Mateo twice, early on, and then my mother told me it was better for everyone, including the baby, if I stepped back and let the financial support speak for itself, rather than creating a complicated custody situation right as we were planning the wedding. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Do you think Diane Aldridge was genuinely trying to protect her son from a difficult situation, or do you think, once you understand the full mechanics of that arrangement, this was always about protecting the family's image above every single person actually involved, including her own grandson? I'm curious what you think, because the deeper I dug into that arrangement over the following weeks, the more clearly I understood exactly which explanation was true. I want to describe, in some detail, exactly how I began uncovering the full scope of what Grant's family had actually orchestrated, because I think the process matters as much as the discoveries themselves. A close friend from architecture school, a woman named Renata Ibarra, who had gone on to become a family law attorney specializing in paternity and custody arrangements, agreed to review everything Grant had told me and help me understand exactly what I was looking at. I want to be honest, I didn't consult Renata initially to build any kind of case against Grant or his family. I consulted her because I needed, desperately, to understand whether the story Grant had told me in that coffee shop was even close to the complete truth, or whether it was simply the most convenient version he could construct once his hand had been forced. Renata's first request was straightforward. She asked whether I could obtain copies of the confidentiality agreement and the financial arrangement Grant had described. Grant, to his credit, provided them without argument, perhaps understanding, by then, that resistance would only deepen my suspicion rather than ease it. What Renata found, reviewing those documents over the following week, confirmed something Grant himself may not have fully understood about his own family's involvement. I want to describe that week of review in a bit more detail because I think the specific process Renata walked me through mattered enormously to how clearly I eventually understood the full scope of what had happened. She spread the documents across her conference table, color-coded with sticky notes flagging particular clauses, and walked me through each provision methodically, the same patient, thorough approach I imagined she used with every client navigating an unfamiliar legal landscape during an already devastating personal crisis. I want you to notice something, she told me, tapping a particular paragraph on the second page. This isn't boilerplate family law language. This is corporate risk management language, dressed up to look like a standard support agreement. Whoever drafted this was thinking about liability exposure for Aldridge Properties first, and Camila and Mateo's actual well-being a distant second. The confidentiality agreement Camila had signed, drafted by Aldridge Properties corporate counsel rather than any family law specialist, was structured less like a standard child support arrangement and more like the kind of severance and non-disclosure agreement typically used to quietly settle disputes with departing employees or business partners. It included provisions prohibiting Camila from any public disclosure of Mateo's parentage, from contacting Grant directly outside of pre-approved monthly check-ins facilitated through the company's legal department, and, most strikingly, a clause stipulating that continued financial support was contingent on Camila's ongoing compliance with those confidentiality terms, a structure that essentially transformed basic child support, something Mateo was legally entitled to regardless of any agreement, into a conditional payment that could theoretically be withheld if Camila ever stepped out of line. This isn't how you protect a child, Renata told me during our second meeting, sliding the document across her desk. This is how you protect a corporate reputation. I've seen agreements like this before, usually in situations involving executives at much larger companies trying to quietly manage a scandal before it becomes public. I have never seen one built around an actual infant. Renata explained, during that same meeting, that basic child support obligations are established by state law and generally cannot be legally conditioned on a parent's silence or compliance with unrelated confidentiality terms, meaning that the entire structure of the agreement Diane had built, threatening implicitly to reduce or withhold support if Camila ever spoke publicly about Mateo's parentage, had likely never been enforceable in any court that might eventually review it. Whoever built this probably knew that, Renata told me, which tells you something important. This agreement was never really designed to survive a legal challenge. It was designed to survive as long as Camila believed it was legally binding and didn't have the resources to find out otherwise. If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, does learning the specific legal structure of that arrangement change how you understand what happened, or had you already suspected, the moment Grant mentioned his mother's involvement, that this was never really about protecting anyone but the Aldridge name? Comment below, because what Renata and I discovered next revealed exactly how long this arrangement had actually been in place, and exactly how deliberately Diane Aldridge had worked to keep it hidden from me specifically. Renata's review of the account structure Grant's mother had set up revealed something that troubled me even more than the confidentiality agreement itself. The monthly payments to Camila had begun in March, the month after Mateo's birth, nearly 5 months before Grant and I had even resumed our relationship. This meant Diane Aldridge had known about her grandson's existence, had personally structured a financial and legal arrangement to manage the situation months before Grant and I got back together, and had continued managing that arrangement quietly, invisibly, throughout our entire engagement, through 8 months of wedding planning, through countless family dinners where Diane had sat across from me discussing seating charts and floral arrangements with a composure I now understood had been built directly on top of an actively managed secret. I want to describe one particular memory that resurfaced for me once I understood that timeline clearly, a dinner about 5 months before the wedding when Diane had spent nearly 20 minutes discussing, in meticulous detail, her vision for the chapel's floral arrangements, debating peony varieties with an intensity that had struck me, at the time, as simply her characteristic thoroughness. I understand now, looking back, that she had been managing an active monthly payment to Camila for over 2 months by that point, sitting across the table from me with an expression of complete, untroubled composure, while discussing rose gold versus ivory place settings. That particular capacity for compartmentalization unsettled me more, in some ways, than almost any other single detail I uncovered during that entire investigation. I want to tell you about the moment I decided I needed to speak with Diane directly, because I think it reveals something important about the kind of clarity that had settled into me since that chapel doorway. I did not want revenge, exactly, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't want accountability in its purest, most direct form. What I wanted, more than anything, was to understand from Diane herself exactly how she had justified, to herself, spending 8 months sitting across from me at increasingly elaborate wedding planning meetings while actively managing the concealment of her own grandson's existence. I called Diane directly, 2 weeks after the wedding that never happened, and asked to meet with her alone, without Grant present. She agreed, somewhat to my surprise, and we met at her office at Aldridge Properties' downtown headquarters, a glass-walled corner suite with a view of the same skyline I had spent years helping to reshape through my own architectural work. Diane, when I arrived, offered none of the performed warmth I had grown accustomed to over 3 years of knowing her. She was, instead, direct in a way I almost appreciated, given everything else about this entire situation. "I assume you want an explanation," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her expansive desk. "I want the truth," I said. "You've been managing this since March, before Grant and I even got back together. I want to understand exactly why you decided I was someone who needed to be protected from that truth rather than told it." I want to describe that office in a bit more detail because I think the setting itself said something important about the calculation Diane had made. Her desk was bare except for a single framed photograph, a formal family portrait taken at Grant's college graduation, the 3 of them, Diane, Grant, and his late father, standing in front of a limestone building not unlike the chapel where I'd nearly become part of that family myself. I remember looking at that photograph while she considered her response, understanding with a strange, cold clarity that whatever answer she gave me was going to be shaped by the same instinct that had curated that particular image for display, a careful, deliberate construction of exactly the version of the Aldridge family she wanted the world to see. I want to tell you about one more detail from that meeting, something Diane said almost as an aside near the end of our conversation that I think reveals, more clearly than anything else, exactly how she understood her own role in the family. "I've spent 30 years making the difficult decisions so that Grant never had to," she said, gathering a stack of papers on her desk with the same brisk efficiency she likely applied to every business decision she'd made across 3 decades running that company. "I don't expect you to understand that kind of protection. I'm not sure anyone outside this family ever really can. I remember hearing that she had just described, without seeming to fully recognize it herself, exactly the problem at the center of everything that had happened. A mother who had spent 30 years making decisions on her son's behalf so thoroughly that he had never developed the capacity to make a difficult, honest decision entirely on his own. Even one as fundamental as telling the woman he wanted to marry the truth about his own child. Diane was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the defensive justification I had half expected, and instead something closer to a cold, practical honesty that I think revealed more about her actual priorities than any softer explanation could have. Grant was about to take over as president of this company, she said. We were 18 months from finalizing the largest development deal in this firm's history, a partnership that required demonstrating exactly the kind of stability and judgment our investors needed to see in the next generation of this family's leadership. An unplanned child from a brief relationship, discovered publicly at exactly the wrong moment, would have raised serious questions about Grant's judgment, questions our investors did not need to be asking during a critical negotiation period. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Do you think Diane genuinely believed that explanation justified everything that followed? Or do you think, hearing it stated that plainly, it reveals exactly how far some families are willing to let business interests override basic honesty with the people they claim to love? Let me know below, because what Diane said next is the moment I understood completely exactly what kind of family I had almost married into. I'm curious, I said, keeping my voice level. At what point in your plan was I supposed to find out the truth? Was there ever actually a version of this where you intended to tell me before I found out the way I did? Diane's silence, that time, lasted long enough to answer the question more clearly than any words could have. I hoped, she finally said, that the situation would resolve itself quietly enough that it would never need to become your concern at all. I want to tell you, sitting across from her in that glass-walled office, I felt something crystallize completely, a certainty that had been building since the chapel doorway, but that finally, in that exact moment, became fully, permanently solid. Diane had never intended for me to know. Not before the wedding, not during the marriage, potentially not ever, unless circumstances beyond her control eventually forced the truth into the open, the way Camila's own desperation had finally forced it into the open in that chapel. I had been, in the calculus Diane had constructed, simply a variable to be managed alongside investors and business partners, someone whose comfort and knowledge mattered less than the smooth continuation of a corporate succession plan. I left that office without saying anything further. There was nothing further I understood that needed to be said. Diane had told me everything I needed to know about exactly how she had weighed my future against her company's interests, and the scale had never once tipped in my favor. I want to describe the drive home from that meeting because I think it marked a genuine turning point in how I understood the entire situation. I remember sitting at a red light a few blocks from Aldridge Properties headquarters, looking up at the glass tower behind me in my rearview mirror, and feeling something shift definitively inside me, the last small, stubborn hope I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying, some quiet wish that Diane might offer an explanation that made the whole situation feel less calculated, more forgivable, finally releasing its grip. It didn't happen gradually, the way I might have expected grief or anger to fade. It happened almost instantly in the space of that single red light, a clean, total release of any remaining investment in salvaging a relationship with a family that had never fully considered me anything more than a variable to be managed. If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, after hearing Diane's explanation directly from her own mouth, do you think there was ever any real chance of reconciliation with Grant, or had that possibility already ended the moment his mother admitted she'd hoped I would simply never find out at all? Comment below, because what happened over the following months, both to me and to the Aldridge family's business, unfolded in ways none of us fully anticipated. I want to tell you what happened with Camila and Mateo, because I think their story matters as much as my own in the aftermath of everything that unfolded. About 3 weeks after my meeting with Diane, I reached out to Camila directly, an outreach that surprised her considerably given the circumstances under which we'd first met. I told her, honestly, that I had no anger toward her, that I understood, completely, why 8 months of stonewalled promises and a confidentiality agreement structured to protect a company rather than a child had finally driven her to the chapel that afternoon. I asked if she would be willing to meet, and she agreed, cautiously, over coffee at a shop near her apartment on the east side of Austin. Camila told me, over that coffee, the fuller story of what those 8 months had actually looked like from her side of the arrangement. She had met Grant at a conference during our separation, both of them, by her account, genuinely believing at the time that their relationship might become something real, before Grant had reconnected with me in August and ended things with her almost immediately, learning of her pregnancy only weeks later. He told me he wanted to be involved, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table between us. For the first few months, he actually was showing up for appointments, talking about custody arrangements. Then the wedding planning started, and his mother started handling everything, and Grant just stepped back. I kept being told it was temporary. I kept believing that longer than I probably should have. I want to tell you about the rest of that conversation because I think it matters beyond just the facts of the arrangement itself. Camila told me she had considered reaching out to me directly on several occasions over those 8 months, had even drafted messages she never sent, terrified of what it might mean for her ongoing support if she violated the confidentiality agreement's terms before she fully understood, as Renata later confirmed for her, that those terms had never actually been enforceable in the way Aldridge Properties lawyers had implied. I chose the wedding because I knew it was the one place your family's lawyers couldn't quietly manage the outcome, she told me. With a small, tired honesty I found myself respecting more than I expected to. I'm not proud of how I did it. I just didn't see another way that would actually work after 8 months of being told to wait. I connected Camila with Renata directly, understanding that whatever legal support I could offer, given my own resources and my own newly acute understanding of exactly how the Aldridge family operated, was the most concrete, useful thing I could actually do for her and for Matteo. Renata took Camila's case formally, and within 2 months, had successfully renegotiated the entire arrangement, striking the confidentiality provisions that had never been legally enforceable in the first place given that basic child support cannot legally be made contingent on silence, and establishing a proper, unconditional custody and support agreement that finally gave Camila the stability she had been seeking for the better part of a year. I want to tell you, watching that resolution unfold from a small distance, that it brought me a kind of quiet satisfaction I hadn't fully expected. I had lost a wedding, a fiancé, and, in some sense, 3 years of a future I'd believed in completely. But watching Camila finally secure something real and lasting for her son, built on documentation rather than a fragile, conditional arrangement designed primarily to protect someone else's reputation, felt like the one unambiguously good outcome to emerge from the entire wreckage. Camila and I have stayed in occasional contact since, an unlikely friendship neither of us could have predicted the afternoon she walked down that aisle holding Matteo against her hip. She sent me a photograph a few months ago, Matteo taking his first wobbling steps across her living room floor, his face caught mid-laugh in a way that no longer, I noticed, made my chest tighten the way it once might have. I responded with genuine warmth, asked how he was doing with the new custody schedule Renata had helped establish, and felt, typing that message, a strange, quiet gratitude that something good and stable had grown out of the very worst day of my own life. I don't think either of us set out to become friends. I think, simply, we became 2 women who understood something true about each other that almost no one else fully could, and that understanding turned out to matter more than the circumstances that had first connected us. I want to tell you about the last time Camila and I met in person, about 8 months after the wedding that never happened, at a small park near her apartment where Matteo could run across the grass while we talked. She told me, watching him chase a stray soccer ball someone had left behind, that she'd finally stopped feeling the particular anxious vigilance she'd carried for most of his first year, the constant, low-grade fear that the arrangement supporting them could be altered or withdrawn at any moment if she stepped even slightly out of line. I finally feel like this is actually mine, she said, meaning, I understood, not just the financial security, but the simple, uncomplicated right to exist openly as Matteo's mother without needing anyone's careful management or permission. I felt something settle in my own chest, hearing that, a quiet confirmation that whatever had been lost in that chapel doorway, something equally real and lasting had been built in its place. If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, would you have reached out to Camila the way I did, or would the entire situation have felt too raw and complicated to extend that kind of support? Let me know below, because what happened to Aldridge Properties itself, once the full story became public, reshaped the entire trajectory of Grant's career in ways his mother's careful planning had specifically been trying to prevent. The story did become public, inevitably, given the size of the wedding and the prominence of the Aldridge name within Austin's business community. A regional business publication ran a detailed feature roughly 6 weeks after the interrupted wedding, drawing on public records, statements from several guests who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, and, though I never confirmed this directly, what I suspect was at least some information from sources within Aldridge Properties itself who had grown uncomfortable with how the situation had been managed internally. The article did not paint a flattering picture of either Grant or his mother, describing, in careful, well-sourced detail, exactly the kind of corporate-style confidentiality arrangement Diane had constructed around her own grandson. I want to tell you a bit more about the specific development deal Diane had cited as her primary concern, because the irony of its ultimate outcome still strikes me as almost too neat to be believed. The partnership involved a consortium of out-of-state investors interested in funding a major mixed-use development along Austin's rapidly growing Eastern Corridor, a deal Diane had spent nearly 2 years cultivating and had specifically identified, during our conversation in her office, as the reason the truth needed to remain contained until after the wedding. I later learned, through industry contacts, that the lead investor on that consortium had a personal policy of walking away from any partnership where leadership integrity came into public question, regardless of the underlying facts, precisely because, as he was quoted saying in the same article that broke the story, the way people handle a crisis reveals more about their judgment than the crisis itself ever could. The timing could not have been worse for the Aldridge family, landing squarely in the middle of the major development partnership negotiation Diane had specifically cited as her reasoning for keeping the situation hidden in the first place. The investors involved in that deal, according to industry sources I later heard through my own professional network, grew notably cautious in the wake of the story, less concerned, I suspect, with the underlying facts of an unplanned pregnancy, which happens in countless families without any lasting business consequence, and more concerned with what the story revealed about Diane and Grant's judgment and honesty under pressure. Exactly the qualities investors most need to trust in the leadership of a major, long-term development partnership. Grant, I learned through mutual acquaintances rather than any direct contact, was quietly moved out of his position as president-in-waiting within 4 months of the wedding that never happened, a shift the company described publicly in vague language about, restructuring leadership to focus on core strategic priorities, language that fooled almost no one within Austin's tightly networked real estate community. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with a former colleague, someone who had worked closely with Grant on several Aldridge Properties projects over the years, who reached out to me unprompted about 6 months after everything happened, wanting, he said, to share something he thought I deserved to know. He told me that the board's decision to remove Grant from the succession track hadn't come from any single dramatic moment, but rather from a slow accumulation of discomfort among longtime board members who had, in the wake of the story becoming public, begun quietly revisiting other decisions Grant had made over the preceding years, wondering, retroactively, how many other situations had been managed with the same instinct toward concealment rather than transparency. It wasn't really about the baby, my former colleague told me. It was about what the whole situation revealed about how decisions get made in that family when something inconvenient happens. Once people started looking for that pattern, they found it in places nobody had thought to question before. I want to describe what that conversation actually revealed in a bit more detail, because I think it matters beyond just Grant's personal consequences. My former colleague mentioned, specifically, 2 prior business disputes, unrelated entirely to the wedding or to Camila, where Aldridge Properties had quietly settled disagreements with subcontractors and a former business partner using similarly restrictive confidentiality language. Disputes that had never become public, but that board members apparently began re-examining once the pattern of the family's preference for concealment over transparency became undeniable. Diane built a company culture around managing problems quietly, he told me. For years, everyone assumed that was just good business discretion. It took your wedding for people to really sit with what that discretion had actually been protecting all along. I want to tell you about my own life in the months since, because I think it matters more than any account of the Aldridge family's business struggles. I returned to my design studio almost immediately after canceling the wedding, throwing myself into a major adaptive reuse project I'd been developing for nearly 2 years, the conversion of a historic train depot into a mixed-use community space, a project that had felt, in the exhausting final months of wedding planning, like something I could barely find the energy to properly focus on. In the months since, freed from the particular weight of a relationship that had, I came to understand, been quietly built on a foundation I'd never actually been shown the full truth of, that project flourished in ways that surprised even me, eventually winning a regional design award that brought my studio more visibility and client interest than I'd generated in the previous 5 years combined. I want to describe that depot project in a bit more detail because I think it captures something important about the specific kind of work I returned to and found meaning in during those difficult months. The building had sat empty and deteriorating for nearly 40 years, its original brick facade obscured by decades of graffiti and neglect, and I had spent countless hours over the preceding 2 years studying old photographs and structural surveys, trying to understand exactly how to honor what the building had originally been while transforming it into something genuinely useful for the neighborhood growing up around it again. There was something quietly, powerfully symbolic, working on that particular project during those months, taking something that had been left to decay under the weight of other people's neglect and finding, patiently, methodically, exactly how to bring it back to life on its own terms rather than someone else's convenient timeline. I don't think I fully recognized the parallel while I was living inside it, but looking back now, I understand exactly why that project mattered to me as much as it did during that specific chapter of my life. The award ceremony itself took place about 9 months after the wedding that never happened, a regional design gala held in a renovated theater downtown, and I remember standing at the podium accepting the recognition, looking out at a room full of colleagues and clients who had no idea, most of them, exactly what the preceding year had actually looked like behind the scenes of that project's completion. I thought, standing there, about the version of myself who had walked down a side aisle in a wedding dress 8 months earlier, uncertain of almost everything about her future, and I felt a quiet, steady pride that had nothing to do with Grant or the Aldridge family at all, a pride built entirely on work I had done with my own hands and my own persistence, exactly the kind of foundation I understood clearly by then, that no one else could ever quietly take away from me the way Diane had once tried to manage every other part of my life without my knowledge. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my mother about 2 months after everything happened because I think it captures something important about how I've come to understand the entire experience. She asked me, gently, whether I regretted the 3 years I'd spent with Grant, given how it had all ultimately unraveled. I sat with that question for a long moment before answering, honestly, that I didn't, not entirely. I had learned things about partnership, about the specific kind of attention and care I wanted from someone building a life with me, that I don't think I would have understood as clearly without those 3 years, even given how the relationship ultimately ended. What I did regret, I told her, was not trusting my own instincts more fully during that 4-month separation, the period when some part of me had genuinely wondered whether Grant's family's world was one I actually wanted to fully enter, a doubt I had let his eventual proposal quietly override rather than examining more closely. My mother, listening to that answer, told me something I've thought about often since. You've always been someone who trusts what you can see with your own eyes over what people tell you they intend, she said. That's why you're such a good architect. You don't take a building's history at face value. You investigate the actual structure underneath. I think, somewhere in the last 3 years, you let yourself stop applying that same instinct to the people in your life, and I think you're going to be more careful about that going forward, not because you should distrust everyone, but because you already know how to look closely. You just have to remember to actually do it, even when looking closely at someone you love feels uncomfortable. I have carried that observation with me since, turning it over during quiet moments at my drafting table, understanding more clearly each time exactly how true it was. I want to mention, briefly, one more detail before I move toward closing this story. Something small that I think matters more than its size suggests. About 8 months after everything happened, I ran into Maricela, Grant's younger cousin, whom I had always liked during my years with the family, at a farmer's market near my studio, a coincidence that struck me, in the moment, as strange enough to almost feel arranged by something larger than chance. She hugged me, told me she'd thought about reaching out many times but hadn't known what to say, and then told me something that stayed with me. You know, growing up in that family, I always thought the way things got handled quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, was just how a certain kind of family operates. Watching what happened to you made me realize how much that pattern had actually cost people over the years. Not just you. I don't think anyone in that family will ever fully talk about it, but I think a few of us understand now more clearly exactly what we grew up watching normalized. I appreciated her honesty, and I think about it sometimes as one more small confirmation that the truth, once it surfaces, tends to ripple further and reach more people than we initially expect, well beyond the 2 or 3 people most directly involved in the original deception. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something before I close the story. Do you think there were earlier warning signs in the 3 years before that chapel doorway that I simply chose not to look at too closely, the way so many of us do when we want desperately to believe in the version of a relationship we've already decided to commit to? I'm curious what you think, because looking back now, I can identify at least a dozen small moments, Diane's particular brand of controlled warmth, Grant's occasional evasiveness about certain stretches of his schedule during our engagement, that I think I noticed on some level and chose not to examine too closely at the time. I want to describe a few of those moments specifically because I think naming them plainly matters more than simply gesturing vaguely at hindsight. There were, over the 8 months of our engagement, at least 4 occasions when Grant left the room to take a call he described, afterward, as a work thing, his voice carrying a tightness I noticed but never questioned. There's a weekend, about 5 months before the wedding, when Grant told me he was traveling to Dallas for a site visit, and I remember, faintly, a strange discomfort when I later saw a receipt on our shared credit card account from a children's clothing boutique in that same city, a detail I dismissed at the time as a probable gift for a colleague's child. I understand now, of course, exactly what that receipt actually represented. I don't share these details to punish myself with hindsight, but because I think it's important for anyone listening to understand that these warning signs are rarely as invisible as we tell ourselves they were. They are, more often, simply inconvenient, and inconvenience is a powerful enough force to keep even a fairly observant person from looking as closely as they otherwise might. I received one message from Grant, about 3 months after the wedding that never happened, sent late on a Sunday night. I think about that chapel every single day. It read, "I know I don't have any right to ask this, but I hope you know that everything about wanting to marry you is real, even if I handled everything around it so badly. I'm sorry for all of it, more than I know how to say in a text message." I read that message several times, reading it, a complicated mixture of things that had mostly settled, by then, into something closer to quiet distance than active anger. I want to tell you honestly, I drafted several responses to that message over the following weeks, none of which I ever actually sent. One version was angry, cataloging exactly what his silence had cost me, Camila, and even his own son. Another version was almost gentle, an acknowledgement that I understood how genuinely frightened he must have been, at 29, facing a situation his family had trained him, his entire life, to manage through concealment rather than honesty. I never sent either version, ultimately, because I came to understand that whatever response I offered would be for my own processing rather than for any actual change it might produce in him. Grant's message asked, implicitly, for something I wasn't sure I had the capacity or the obligation to give him, absolution, or at least acknowledgement, for a choice that had cost other people far more than it had ever cost him directly. I have not responded to it. I don't think I need to. Whatever was real about wanting to marry me existed alongside 8 months of active concealment, orchestrated with his mother's full knowledge and participation, and I've come to understand that those two facts don't cancel each other out. They simply exist together, an uncomfortable, complicated truth I've stopped needing to resolve into something simpler than it actually is. Some truths I've learned are allowed to remain exactly that complicated, without ever needing to be smoothed over into a version that's easier for anyone else to hear. I still think, sometimes, about that cowlick, the exact same stubborn swirl of hair at Mateo's crown that I'd watched Grant try and fail to tame with product every single morning for 3 years. I think about how a single physical detail, inherited without anyone's permission or planning, became the thing that finally, undeniably, cracked open a secret an entire family had spent 8 months carefully constructing walls around. I don't know that I believe in fate, exactly, but I do believe, now, in the particular, stubborn insistence of truth to eventually surface, however carefully it's been buried, however much money and legal language is spent trying to keep it contained. I want to leave you with one more reflection before I close the story, something I've come to understand more clearly with each month that's passed since that chapel doorway. I spent 3 years believing that the strength of a relationship could be measured by how easy it felt, by how rarely we argued, by how effortlessly Grant made me feel important in any room we entered together. I understand now that ease, on its own, tells you almost nothing about whether someone will actually choose honesty over convenience when honesty becomes difficult and costly. Grant was never dishonest with me about small things. He remembered my coffee order and my mother's birthday and the specific way I liked to be comforted after a hard day at the office. It was only when the truth threatened something larger, his family's business timeline, his mother's carefully cultivated image, his own comfort in avoiding a difficult conversation, that the ease I had mistaken for character revealed itself as something else entirely, a willingness to manage me the same careful way Diane managed investors and board members, rather than a genuine partnership built on equal footing. I want to tell you about a small, quiet ritual I've developed since everything happened, something I do most Sunday mornings now, sitting at my drafting table with coffee before the rest of the world wakes up. I sketch, sometimes just idle lines with no particular project attached, sometimes actual plans for buildings I may never get the chance to construct, and I let myself think, during that hour, about exactly what kind of foundation I want the next chapter of my life to be built on. Not ease. Not the practiced comfort of someone skilled at making a room feel warmer simply by entering it. Something closer to what Renata showed me in that conference room, full documentation, structural honesty, the kind of foundation that holds up completely even when someone eventually decides to look closely enough to test it. I have not, as of this recording, started dating again, though I'm not opposed to it eventually. What I have done in the months since is spend a great deal of time examining exactly what I actually want from a partnership beyond warmth, beyond ease, beyond the specific feeling of being made to feel interesting in a crowded room. I want now someone whose honesty holds up specifically under pressure, when honesty becomes inconvenient rather than effortless, because I understand now that this is the only kind of honesty that actually matters when it counts. I want to tell you about the Depot project one final time before I close, because I think it offers the clearest possible image of where I've landed since everything happened. The building officially reopened to the public about a year after the wedding that never happened, its original brick facade cleaned and restored, its interior transformed into exactly the kind of flexible, community-serving space I had spent 2 years imagining it could become. I walked through it alone, the week before its public opening, running my hand along a section of original brick we'd deliberately left exposed rather than covering entirely, a decision I'd made specifically because I believe a building's history should remain visible even as it moves into a new chapter, rather than being erased or hidden the way Diane had tried so carefully to erase and hide an inconvenient truth for 8 months. I stood there for a long time, in that quiet, half-finished space, feeling something settle in me that had nothing to do with Grant or the Aldridge family at all, a simple, steady confirmation that I knew exactly how to build something true and lasting, with my own 2 hands, regardless of whatever else had fallen apart around me. I think, in the end, that's the truest thing I can offer anyone listening who might be standing at the edge of a similar unraveling right now, wondering whether the foundation they've built their future on is actually as solid as it appears. You will not always know, in advance, exactly which small, dismissed detail is quietly holding the whole structure together, or which one is the first hairline crack in something that was never as stable as it looked. But you will know, eventually, if you're willing to look closely enough and trust what you actually see rather than what you've already decided to believe. I know that now. With a certainty I didn't fully possess 3 years ago, standing in a ruined limestone kitchen, sketching ideas onto the back of a coffee cup sleeve with a man I thought I understood completely. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had a truth arrive at exactly the moment it could no longer be avoided, comment the cowlick below. So I know you understand exactly what that chapel doorway meant, and exactly what it cost an entire family to have it finally, undeniably proven true in front of everyone they were trying to protect it from. And I'll see you in the next story.